Hello, and welcome to this year's Baxter Liberty Initiative event. We're delighted to bring this event back for its 12th year. My name is Raka Ray, and I'm the Dean of the Social Sciences here at Berkeley. For those of you who are new to the Baxter Initiative, as an alum, Frank Baxter recognized that our conservative students and community members needed additional outlets to build community and to express themselves. I want to thank my predecessor and former Dean Carla Hesse for partnering with Frank Baxter to address these issues on campus. Universities were always meant to be spaces for ideas to be tested out against each other, so that the best new ideas can emerge, as they do, out of debate, argument, and reflection. Universities are the very place where we can showcase the marvelous range of ideas that exist in the world, and to do so with our intellects and with civility. So I'm grateful to the vision and curiosity of Frank Baxter, because of whom we now have a space where diverse viewpoints are explored and challenged. Over the years, Dean Hesse and Frank Baxter have worked to genuinely maintain Berkeley's legacy and the Chancellor's commitment to free speech on campus. And tonight, their success is evidenced by the largest turnout we have had in the last 12 years. It is of great importance to me that all those in our community feel that they belong. So thank you, Frank, for your collaboration and commitment to Berkeley over the years. I look forward to the evolution of this initiative. And now, I'm delighted to turn the virtual podium over to Gabe Lenz, Professor of Political Science, who has been the faculty coordinator for this event. Thank you, Gabe, for your efforts over the past several years and for your commitment to this initiative. Thank you for having me. I look forward to this evening, and over to you.
Thank you, Dean Raka. It's with tremendous pleasure that I welcome everybody to the Baxter Liberty Initiative. Unfortunately, it's virtual. It's a pandemic lecture, but we're thrilled that we can still make it possible and thrilled to reach an even broader audience, maybe because of it. I'm a political science professor in the Charles and Louise Travers Department of Political Science. And if you haven't heard, this is one of the great political science departments in the country, and it's headed by, or chaired by, Chris Ansell, who is here in the audience today. We're also happy to have Chuck and Beth Travers joining us today. And Chuck's colleague and UC Berkeley Foundation board member, Mark Desser, joining us. Thank you, Mark. We also would like to thank and recognize for their support of this program, Chancellor Carol Christ, Provost Paul Alivasados, and Vice Chancellor of Research, Randy Katz. Now I'd like to introduce you to Frank Baxter. Frank is a Cal alum, class of 1961. He is Chairman Emeritus of Jefferies & Company, a global bank where he was Chief Executive Officer for many years. He was the ambassador to the Republic of Uruguay from 2006 to 2009, a member of the board of NASDAQ, and former director of the Security Industries Association. Ambassador Baxter is deeply engaged in philanthropic and leadership activities, including chairman of the Alliance of College-Ready Public Schools, a charter organization of 28 schools serving 12,000 low-income students. Ambassador Baxter is also emeritus member of the Letters and Sciences Advisory Board, a member of the Southern California Chancellor's Cabinet, and serves on the UC Berkeley Foundation Board of Trustees. Ambassador Baxter has been at the forefront of some of the most important issues facing society, and he's done that here again by facilitating a forum encouraging free discourse and diversity of thought on campus. And we're absolutely thrilled and thankful for his sponsorship of this program. And now I will turn it over to Frank.
Thank you very much, Gabe, and hi, everybody. It's so great to be here. I was thinking that our forefathers had a really good sense of mankind and its limitations and its problems and how to deal with them. And there's the wonderful thing about them was the skepticism. And a young fellow about my age named Benjamin Franklin, when asked, is it going to be a dictatorship or a republic? And he said, a republic if we can keep it. And I think this set of lectures is just talking about how we can keep it, when we can keep it. And we started with the wonderful Nobel Prize winner, Gary Becker, and it's just gotten better and better ever since. And it's certainly that is the case today with Professor Leo Ohanian. He's professor of economics and director of the Edinger Family Program of Microeconomic Research at UCLA, a neighbor of mine in Los Angeles. We don't call it the junior college. He is also a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at another university across the water, and the associate director of the Center of Advanced Study in Economic Efficiency at Arizona State University. He's an advisor to the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, and previously has advised other Federal Reserve banks, foreign central banks, and the National Science Foundation. Professor Ohanian has been an economic advisor to state and national political campaigns and has testified to the US Senate and the California State Legislative Assembly. His research, which has recently been discussed in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and other media sources, focuses on economic crises and has been published widely in a number of peer-reviewed journals. He is a frequent columnist for the Wall Street Journal, the San Francisco Chronicle, and other media. And he's certainly very well qualified to discuss this particular issue. We're really anxious to hear from you, Professor Ohanian.
Ambassador Baxter, thank you so much for your warm introduction, and I'm delighted to join you today and have the opportunity to contribute to the Baxter Liberty Lectures. Today, I'd like to share some ideas with everyone about how California has changed. In my lifetime, I've seen enormous changes in our state. Not all have been for the positive. I think about the California that I grew up in, and that I and millions of other Californians had the good fortune to succeed and to enjoy what I'll call the California dream. And today that California dream is available to far fewer people. I'll discuss some ideas why that has been the case, and I'll try to present some nonpartisan solutions that I feel will help restore that dream. I'll do this by comparing two periods of time. Before 1970, when California had extremely rapid growth and a very successful economy, and after 1970, when growth slowed and both the cost of living for households and business costs rose remarkably. And my thesis, and what I'll try to convey to you, is that policy missteps and governance missteps are the primary reasons why the dream has ended for so many. And what I'd like to get across and convey to you is that this is really deeply rooted in lack of incentives or the proper incentives within government and a lack of accountability within government organizations. I'm going to suggest that it's not going to take a magic wand to fix this. Rather, the restoration of common sense economics and policymaking, and more specifically and tightly focused leadership, is the way we can make the California dream attainable again for so many more. I'm going to start by setting the stage and give you a one-slide, one-century backdrop of California. And let's go back to 1900. At that time, there were just 2 million people in California. It was a median-sized state. It was 2.5% of the US population. Believe it or not, Alabama and Mississippi were larger. Ohio was nearly 4 times as large. And Chicago, with 1.7 million people, was nearly as large as the entire state of California. Now, between 1900 and 1960, something remarkable happened. California took off like no one had even possibly expected. Those 2 million people became 16 million of us. We rose to 9% of the entire country's population. And to put that in perspective, if California had just grown at the same rate as the entire country, we would have had just 4.4 million people in California in 1960, roughly 1/4 of what we had achieved. It seemed like everybody wanted to be in California. And who could blame them? The most amazing weather you can imagine, just gorgeous beaches, and rapidly increasing and high-paying job opportunities, and a place where business was thriving. Now, as these 16 million people flooded into California, managing that growth was challenging for our state government. The population was very young. 50% of us in 1960 were under 24 years of age. And what that means from the standpoint of a state budget is that there were relatively few taxpayers. The per capita inflation adjusted state budget at that time was just 20% of today's budget. And with so many of us 24 years or younger, there were a lot of budget demands. K-12 schools, colleges and universities, hospitals. Substantial infrastructure investment was needed, including that in water, roads, electrical utilities. And despite all these challenges, half of our population being so young they weren't paying taxes, enormous growth, the state government found a way to accomplish all of this. Now, they were able to do this because at that time there was a principle of governance in place within the state that was based on investment and being remarkably careful about how government used taxpayer dollars. And there were really two principles in place at this time in the 1950s and 1960s. Government spending should be based on what people really want, and it should be done very efficiently. Use that revenue wisely. Don't waste it. At this time, capital investment was a remarkable 25% of the state budget, almost unheard of. And that was required because of all those young people and the need for hospitals and schools and roads and water infrastructure and universities. And those investments were remarkably efficient. California's K-12 schools at that time were the top rated in the country, and US schools were the best in the world. And while some universities were created before that time, we managed to build new community colleges, new state universities, and some new UCs. We made major water, road, and utility investments. At that time, there was a remarkably effective public-private partnership between state and local governments and between households and businesses. In working together, we created the California Dream. There is a shared bipartisan vision at that time. It was held by both Democrats and Republicans, and that vision was one of sensible limits on government and a real focus on public investment and creating new infrastructure. What I'm going to share with you here on this slide are some budget statements from Governor Pat Brown's budgets in the early 1960s. And here's what he had to say. We must invest to accommodate our magnificent growth. So there's a realization that people were pouring into California, and new California babies were being born every minute. And there was a recognition that investment had to take place if we're going to be able to take care of these people. And Governor Brown also noted government's priority is to protect and invest. And he also noted the importance of using tax dollars efficiently. We can't abuse taxpayers. We must use their precious tax dollars. Those are his words. We must use their precious tax dollars wisely. Well, this is a period that people poured into California, and government working together with the private sector created a dream. California flourished. As a kid growing up in California in the 1960s, my friends and I thought that anything and everything was possible. We were part of the California dream, and we knew we were very lucky. Every time we turned on the Rose Bowl on January 1st, and the TV camera would pan to somewhere in Minnesota where it was 0 degrees and there was 3 feet of snow, and we looked at the Rose Bowl and it was 70 degrees, and we had just great lives, and we knew we had something very, very special. Now let's contrast that with California today. Spending it's skyrocketed. California state government spends 5 times as much today, adjusted for population growth and adjusted for inflation. So I'm making this comparison on an apples to apples basis. There's been a 5 times increase in government spending, but basic government functions are just not getting done. The focus on investment that was discussed by Governor Pat Brown, that's just no longer here. We don't spend 25% of our budget on capital investments, or 20% or 10%. It's closer to 4%, and that 4% is probably a bit too high. And spending at 4% of the budget, well, that doesn't cover the depreciation of capital goods. Not surprisingly, our infrastructure is graded a D+ by the U.S. Society of Civil Engineers. 1,680 of our dams are considered to be in risky condition. And I'm glad all of you are home and don't need to drive, because 1 out of 18 of our bridges are considered to be structurally deficient. Basic functions such as taking care of our infrastructure is just not getting done. And because we're not investing in infrastructure, that infrastructure that was built in the 1950s and 1960s during the heyday of California investments, that's now failing. And failing, of course, endanger life, and they are extremely costly to fix. So as one example, I'm going to refer to the Oroville Dam, which failed in 2017 when its spillway was breached, and engineers had to release 200,000 gallons of water per second to try to preserve it. That dam was built in 1968. 188,000 people were evacuated because of fear that the entire dam would fail and spill and have a catastrophic failure. Well, in 2005, 12 years before the spillway failed, there were recommendations to retrofit that dam. It wasn't done. In 2013, 14, and 15, cracks began to develop in that dam. And in 2017, the spillway failed. It cost $1.1 billion to fix the failed Oroville Dam. Why weren't those recommendations followed? Why weren't the cracks that developed, why weren't those taken more seriously? We should be able to do better than this. And where's the accountability? Accountability is important in any organization because people in organizations have to own what they're responsible for. And when they're required to own it, that puts additional incentives in place for them to do the right thing. If that dam had been retrofitted prior to 2017, it would have cost somewhere around $40 million. Not to mention not having to evacuate 188,000 people, and not to mention how much water we lost in a state where every drop seems to matter. Well, without water investments, water becomes really scarce. Within our state, most water pipes are now 60 years old or more. Most of these are cast iron. They have a lifespan, an expected lifespan of somewhere around 50 years. So if you're driving around and you find where you're going, you've been rerouted because of a flood from a burst water pipe, there's no surprise about that. They're in overtime. As a state, we've really made no new major water investments since the California Water Project, which was dreamed up by California political leaders in the 1950s and early 1960s. That was largely completed by the late 1970s. And I really shouldn't say completed because the entire California Water Project Well, part of it just remains a dream. The state ran out of money. And this is an issue that Senator Dianne Feinstein has pointed to a number of times when she's talked about the drought situations that we face and the fact that we haven't invested in new major water investments since the California Water Project. Well, what's happened is we've added 12 million people to our state in the last 35 years, but water capacity is unchanged. We now have what I'll call semi-regular drought. We have a drought, once every 4 years, once every 5 years, that brings water rationing to our state, which is very, very costly for private homes and for businesses, and in particular damages state agriculture. And when we look at this, we should be asking ourselves, why haven't we made those investments? California was so much poorer and so much more budget stressed back in the 1950s and 1960s, yet those investments were made. Why aren't we making them now? Where's the accountability? Now, the flip side of water, we go to fire. Well, 9 of the 10 biggest fires in California that have consumed the most acreage have been just in the last 8 years. And fire experts have concluded there are 2 major reasons why wildfires have become such a horrendous problem for us in the last few years. One is a failure to thin forests, create new fire breaks, and conduct prescribed burns, which would limit the extent of these fires and make them easier for firefighters to control. Another reason is that our regulators, we put our trust in these people, did not provide adequate oversight of public utilities to maintain their equipment and maintain their power lines. These 2 reasons have, the conclusion by most fire experts is these 2 reasons, the main reasons why we're having so much difficulty. So here we are living in California. It's the most technologically advanced state in the most technically advanced country in the world. And we're living with chronic drought and wildfires as a way of life. So again, I ask, where is the efficiency and where's the accountability? Our failures to invest go beyond thinning forests and investing in water infrastructure. We're also not investing in transportation infrastructure. The Civil Engineering Society I mentioned just a moment ago, they grade our roads as a D. And this is a statistic that really grabbed me. Deficient roads, so potholes and cracks, cost California drivers $27 billion annually in repairs and higher insurance premiums. Higher insurance premiums because those insurers know our roads are not in good condition and you might hit one of those potholes and break an axle on your car. And this is $27 billion annually over and above relative to the rest of the country. If you live in Southern California like I do and you walk the sidewalks of Los Angeles, there are 4,600 miles of LA sidewalks that are broken. And I don't mean little hairline cracks or even cracks about the size, about the diameter of a nickel. These are truly broken sidewalks, 46%. LA doesn't have an adequate repair budget to fix these. And as a result, there's about 400 personal injury lawsuits annually that the city faces. Sadly, many of them, they just hope they'll go away. Some have paid out as much as $3 million to $5 million. If we go back to Governor Pat Brown's statement in his budget when he said government's priority is to protect and invest, it's hard to look at these statistics and believe that that's the case. Seems like government priorities have changed and changed a lot since the day of Pat Brown. We've also failed to invest in just the normal day-to-day things the government does. So this year, on top of the COVID pandemic, about 1.5 million unemployment claims became backlogged for months. So these are folks who have been laid off their jobs because they've been sent home to try to create a solution for COVID. And the reason they're backlogged is because the employment department's 40-year-old IT system crashed. It couldn't keep up with the amount of claims that were coming in. And not only were 1.5 million unemployment claims backlogged, creating real hardship for individuals, 400 billion in fraudulent claims were paid out. Now, this wouldn't happen in the private sector. And not to suggest that the private sector is perfect, but because within the private sector, businesses must compete, in the private sector, there wouldn't be an IT system that would be 40 years old and obsolete, because competition incentivizes efficiency. You just can't survive if you're not efficient. You'll lose your market. You'll have to exit. Incentives and accountability are the reason why we don't see a 40-year-old IT system within the private sector. And this really highlights the important need to improve incentives and improve accountability within our public sectors. Perhaps the biggest problem that Californians face today is in affordable housing. California is 49th in the country in construction, adjusted for our population. And perhaps not surprisingly, we're 49th in housing affordability. To give you an example of just how extreme this is, let me point to San Francisco and Silicon Valley. Incomes in those locations are by far the highest in the state. But despite the highest incomes in the state, only 18% of San Francisco and Silicon Valley households can afford the median priced home in those locations. Just 18%. 82% unable to afford that home, compared to the rest of the country, where about 2/3 of households can afford the median priced home in their location. Now, we haven't been building enough housing for 20 years or more. Question we should ask is why? Why aren't we building enough housing? Well, in a couple of moments, I'm going to describe why state and local government policies are a big reason why we're not building enough housing and why we have a housing crisis. Expensive housing has made it incredibly costly to live in California today. California living costs are 49% higher than the national average. And while we enjoy higher than average wages, they're only about 15% higher than the rest of the country. And that 15% doesn't make up for 49% higher costs of living. Not only is housing expensive, California has the 7th highest electricity costs, the 2nd highest gasoline prices, and a statistic that is remarkably sobering and just deeply sad is that 38% of us live in poverty or near poverty. Sadly, we're home to at least 25% of the country's homeless, 17,000 alone in the city of San Francisco, the most productive city in the country. And Medicaid, which is the government insurance program that's available to very low income households. Well, Medicaid is provided to 14 million Californians. And the only reason they qualify for Medicaid is because they have very low incomes. They're below the poverty limit that Medicaid requires. And if those 14 million people were to be a state, they would be the 5th largest state in the country. So as we look at these statistics, the conclusion that I draw and that I hope you draw is that California dream is no longer attainable for most people. Something is deeply wrong. So what happened? How did we lose our way? We had such a remarkably successful model of governance in the 1950s and 1960s. At 20 cents on the dollar, we were able to make these enormous investments that supported a rapidly growing population, one that had very few taxpayers. So how did we lose our way? Well, the shared principles of reasonable limits on government and efficiency and accountability in governance began to change. And that changed around 1970. And around 1970, a very important change began to happen, and one that we should have recognized far sooner. As a society, particularly in California, we became aware that environmental damage was becoming increasingly important and that we should do something about this. Fair enough. This is important, and this should have been part of the policy playbook. But as we evolved past 1970, the environmental movement became politicized. And in that process of politicization, the standard economic analysis that had guided us was eschewed. And as the environmental movement really took on a life of its own and became an enormous political and social and cultural movement, this abandonment of standard economic thinking, prioritizing what citizens really need, being really efficient, treating tax dollars as precious, well, those ideas seem to fall to the wayside, not just environmental policymaking, but in other state and local government policymaking as well. So since around 1970, we've gradually lost efficiency in government, accountability, and reasonable limits. And when I say reasonable limits, when people are able to focus on a narrow set of problems, great things can happen. Any organization, I don't care which organization it is, the state of California or Google or Apple, the most remarkably successful companies, they have to be focused and specific if they're going to be able to do a good job. So after 1970, we began to lose this shared vision of governance that was so remarkably successful. And I'm going to pick the 1969 Santa Barbara oil spill as really the tipping point that made such a difference. An oil derrick just a few miles off the Santa Barbara coast failed, and 3 million gallons of crude oil spilled into the Santa Barbara Channel. This was an event that was horrific. Worldwide media covered it. As a kid, I remember seeing the morning paper and seeing images of pelicans that were covered with crude oil, and it was heartbreaking. This was a failure that had a huge effect on people within California and outside of California as well. Now, from the standpoint of what this is economically, there's a really standard solution. This is what economists call an externality. It's when some individual or some government or some organization's actions have a substantial effect on others. And it can be positive or negative. In this case, the Santa Barbara oil spill was remarkably negative. Now, within economics, even in 1969, there was a standard way of dealing with externalities, which is to internalize them, which is to say the air and the water need to be cleaned, and they need to be cleaned according to sensible benefit cost analysis. So the solution method was already part of the economist's toolbag at that time. That solution procedure didn't get implemented. If it had, if we had used standard cost benefit analysis in a sober way, we could have protected the environment and we could have maintained the previous shared vision of governance. We should have done this much earlier. We didn't, and we suffered from the Santa Barbara oil spill. Now, it was so dramatic that standard economics was eschewed and a different approach was taken. More of a political or cultural or social approach, an approach which I would like to call do whatever it takes. Now, this do whatever it takes approach to protect the environment became something much bigger, to the point where activists would say, growth and corporate greed, those are the problems. Economic growth and corporations, they're not our friends. They're not making decisions that are consistent with our interests. And they had a point. But what could have been a very focused way of dealing with these issues became a much larger vision of what state and local governments could do. What we saw emerge was many more business regulations, many more labor regulations, which were intended to help workers, but in many cases, which hurt workers, higher government spending, and higher taxes. Now, much of this was more associated with the Democratic Party rather than the Republican Party. And after the mid-1990s, California largely became, and still is, a one-party state. And that occurred pretty much after Proposition 187 was passed. I believe that was in 1996. That was viewed as an anti-immigrant bill, because within Proposition 187, people were supposed to report on undocumented immigrants. And as California became a more diverse state and had more immigrants, the Republican Party was viewed as an anti-immigrant party. Well, Republican Party had about a 40% voter share back in the early 1990s. That share has dropped to 24% today. And what I would like to propose is, whether you're a member of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, or you're independent, or you're a member of another political party, political competition is central. Whether the left are in power or whether the right are in power, because political competition provides discipline on what the other party wants to do. And it provides a voice to those who might disagree with the party who's in power. And so today, and for many years, we haven't really had political competition. And as a consequence, this new vision of government, more regulations, higher taxes, that went well beyond the environmental movement and the abandonment of standard economic principles, that vision has gone unchecked. Now, in 1970, after that Santa Barbara oil spill, the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA, I'll call that CEQA, that was passed in 1970. And I'm copying in here one part of that legislation, which says adopt all feasible measures to mitigate the environmental impacts of development. Well, in economics, feasible doesn't necessarily mean practical. And the way to deal with government policies, again, is cost-benefit analysis. Government programs that provide benefits that at least offset the costs can be implemented. Those that don't should be reconsidered. Well, cost-benefit analysis was not practiced. And it was right around this time when common sense economics was abandoned, and we began to abandon as a state fiscal discipline and ensuring that government was efficient. Let me now speak about how environmental regulations have, in some sense, unintentionally created California's housing crisis. Well, a large literature has emerged in the last 20 years that has studied how CEQA has impacted building. And the conclusion is that CEQA has reduced housing supply and substantially increased construction costs. Now, many in the state legislature know this. Last year, when a housing reform bill was advanced within the Legislative Assembly, one member of the Assembly noted that CEQA has been weaponized to fight development. To give you an idea of how important this has been, between 1940 and 1970, now this was really the heyday of California growth, when California added over 10 million people. During that time, the California housing price premium, California housing cost about 35% more than the rest of the country. So it's always been more expensive to live here, but only by about 1/3. Now, despite that remarkable growth we had between 1940 and 1970, that 35% premium didn't change. And the reason is because, simple economics, supply was able to grow and accommodate that huge population influx. Well, after 1970, construction dropped, and that 35% house price premium rose to 80% by 1980, in just a decade. Today, California is home to 10 of 11 of the most expensive housing metro areas in the country, and 10 of the 12 most expensive rental markets in the country. In CEQA, as well as restrictive zoning that often is based on environmental reasons, but deep down might reflect more the not in my backyard view, these aspects of policy are viewed as the primary reasons why supply hasn't been able to expand, and also for why construction costs have become so high. Today, according to the California Association of Realtors, the median price single family home in the state is $711,000. The median condo, $520,000. Well, in the rest of the country, a single family home median price is $297,000. That 35% premium increased to 137%. To put that in perspective, if that 35% premium had just continued today, the median price single family home wouldn't be over $700,000. It would be about $400,000. And as we have failed to build enough housing, that spills over into the rental market. Median California rent of $2,800, twice as much as in the rest of the country. Let me give an example of just how efficient CEQA has been in terms of impacting housing and why costs have gone up so much. In 1994, a 60,000 population planned community plans were submitted for an area near Valencia, California, about 35 miles outside of LA. So this was going to be a Los Angeles bedroom community. It was known as New Hall Ranch. That was in 1994. I'd like to say that in 1994, your go-to place for entertainment was Blockbuster Video. Only 1 in 4 homes had a personal computer, and the internet was unheard of. No Amazon, no Google, no smartphones. 5 years later, CEQA-related lawsuits have been finally resolved. Maybe in 2021 we'll see the first homes. This has been enormously inefficient and socially costly. It didn't have to be this way. Are policymakers paying attention? Where's the accountability? Now, here's a statistic. If you're in the construction business, or if you built a home recently, or if you remodeled a home recently, this is going to grab you. And this really points to how policies have affected efficiency and also the loss of fiscal discipline. Today, building affordable housing in our state costs about $700 per square foot. It shouldn't be nearly that costly. John Cox, who ran for governor in 2018, once remarked, I build very solid quality housing in Illinois for $180 a square foot. Here seems to cost $700 per square foot. To give an example, Santa Clara County, just this past summer, bought an extended stay motel. They purchased it for $14 million. The plan was to convert that motel with it's a two-room motel. Units have 2 rooms. There's a kitchenette. There's a small living area. There's a bedroom that's 300 square feet. They were going to convert that to apartments for affordable housing for the homeless. Well, in the parlance of the real estate industry, this should be considered as a flip. It's purchasing a motel, but it's going to just convert it into apartments. Nothing was going to be done except adding a communal kitchen. So 6 burners on a range and 2 or 3 ovens, laundry facilities, and some outdoor recreation. Well, this entire project is going to cost $29 million, $14 million to purchase the motel and the land, and then $15 million to add in a communal kitchen, laundry facilities, and a little bit of outdoor recreation. So something's terribly wrong here, but no one in government seems to be questioning this. Again, where's the accountability? Well, speaking of loss of fiscal discipline, immediately after 1970, the state budget began to skyrocket. It rose 142% between 1970 and 1978. And voters responded by passing Proposition 13, which limits property taxes. That was done to try to slow tax increases, but it didn't really work. It slowed down property tax increases, but the legislature responded by raising income taxes, corporate taxes, and sales taxes. Today, California is second only to New York in government spending per person. And this is for states of at least 1.8 million population. States such as Alaska have very high government spending per person, but that's a special situation. So California, second to New York, has the 5th highest personal tax burden and the third highest business tax burden. And taxes in the budget are not only going up, but we've been implementing regulation upon regulation, and we've been losing businesses. Bank of America, Hewlett-Packard, Toyota, Occidental Petroleum are just some of the major companies to have left California, and they have all relocated to low-cost states, primarily Texas. And as we're finding out in COVID, as we figure out how to run businesses with workers who are remote, this is just going to continue unless we make changes. Why are they leaving? We're 49th in business-friendly policies according to the Tax Foundation, and we're 48th in economic freedom according to the Cato Institute. Again, are policymakers listening? Where's the accountability? It doesn't have to be this way. Now, returning to the environment, this is very sad and ironic because some environmental policies are actually damaging the environment. One of the reasons why we haven't thinned forests as much as we should have, or we haven't conducted as many prescribed burns, or we haven't created as many fire breaks, well, those are made difficult by environmental policies. A very sad statistic is that since 2005, in the last 15 years, California's worked very hard to reduce its carbon footprint. And many costly regulations have been implemented to reduce that footprint. Well, the carbon emission reductions that we've seen since 2005 have been roughly offset by carbon emissions from the wildfires that occur annually now. Not to mention the particulate pollution that comes from these wildfires, not to mention the lives lost or other lives that are forever changed because of these wildfires. And I can't think of a better illustration for why cost-benefit analysis is so important. Are policymakers paying attention? Where's the accountability? Our failure to invest in transportation also, ironically, damages the environment. In California, it's been estimated that consumers burned 300 million additional gallons of gasoline annually relative to the national average by sitting in traffic. In 3 California counties, 10%, almost 10% of commuters are what's known as supercommuters. We have people who live in Stockton who drive 90 minutes, 2 hours each way from Stockton to San Francisco or from Stockton to Silicon Valley to be able to access those high-paying jobs. But they live in Stockton because they can't afford the 1.5 million median-priced home in California or the 1.1 million median-priced home in Silicon Valley. So ironically, we're burning tons of gasoline and creating a bigger carbon footprint because we failed to invest in transportation. A hope was that HighSpeed Rail, passed by California voters in, I believe, 2006, was going to be a game changer. Well, as many of you know, HighSpeed Rail, which was supposed to have been a $33 billion budget, completed by 2018, and that was the vision that was sold to taxpayers who approved a bond to do that. That's morphed into $98 billion today to be completed in 2029. It won't be completed. It will soon be out of funding. What we might have is rail service between Bakersfield and Merced. What happened to Pat Brown's dictum, respect the taxpayer, use those precious tax dollars wisely? Incentives, efficiency, and accountability. It doesn't have to be this way. We should have been able to do better. Let me spend my remaining time talking about restoring the dream. No magic wands needed. We just need to return to the application of sensible economics and cost-benefit analysis and focus our leadership the way Governor Pat Brown did back in the 1960s. We've got to incentivize efficiency within government organizations, increase accountability, and policymakers really need to understand that budgets are sacred and those tax dollars are precious. We have amazing technologies available now so that we can protect the environment and make investments and support our growth. Housing, build more. Not just affordable housing, build more of everything. We need to reform CEQA and other regulations to make it easier and less costly to build. And we need to develop inland California. San Francisco is about 900,000 people. It's never going to be home to 3 or 4 million. And we could easily fill San Francisco up with 3 or 4 million. But we have remarkable resources in interior California. We should leverage remote work. The silver lining to the COVID crisis has been to show that we can run businesses with workers working remotely. This is a big plus, and we can repurpose commercial buildings that might no longer be needed for housing. We have to restore efficiency and accountability. 2/3 of our state budget is just for 3 areas: K-12, health and human services, and the prison system. And I think everyone who's looked at these areas unbiasedly agree that all should perform much better. And the way that we can make them better is by implementing efficiency and accountability and reviewing compensation standards and shifting to a compensation system where we really make use of merit-based pay. Right now, state worker compensation is twice as high as in the private sector. And this is not to say the state workers are overpaid, but it does indicate that we should have a broad-based review of how we're setting compensation schedules. Let me just begin with the prison system, and you'll get a sense again of efficiency and accountability. California prisons cost $85,000 per inmate, twice as much as the rest of the country. Why is that? Well, one reason is the California Prison Guards Union is incredibly politically powerful. They've been able to negotiate compensation that's twice as high as the national average. And sadly, they've also resisted reforms that would reduce recidivism. In California right now, felony recidivism is 2/3 within 2 years, meaning that the chance of a felon who is released will be back within prison within 2 years at about a 67% chance. Even though we spend $85,000 per inmate, only 3% of that budget is spent on inmate education, job training, and behavioral therapy combined, just 3%. So it seems obvious what to do here. Repurpose the budget, review compensation, and make sure that the incentives to reduce recidivism do a better job in helping inmates and make sure there's accountability. That's got to be part of the solution. This is 10% of the budget. 14 million Californians are on Medicaid. It's known in a series of auditor reviews that it's inefficient and that there's inadequate accountability, including $4 billion paid in ineligible claims. A 2016 review found that integrity and compliance remain problematic. Remain being the key word because that was the same complaint found in the 2012 review. There's very poor patient satisfaction with California Medicaid. Patients increasingly use the ER and urgent care for basic health services. And one notable study shows that health outcomes for those under Medicaid are about the same as people that don't have insurance whatsoever. There's a number of market-based recommendations that have been made by people who are experts in this area. I'm just going to focus on one, which is requiring pricing transparency by providers. It's been shown that this can reduce costs by 40% or more. People often talk about the market for healthcare. Well, it's an incredibly distorted market. I wouldn't even call it a true market, because in what type of market do you fail to find how much it's going to cost? This is what healthcare has become. So we need to require pricing transparency and give consumers the tools and incentives to shop around and choose cost-effective healthcare. K-12 education. Back in the day, California schools were the top. Today, we're 44th in math, we're 38th in reading. And yes, California it's challenging to provide quality education, but it can be done. Marshall Tuck, who narrowly lost the 2018 state school superintendent race, had a platform of merit and specialist-based pay. The best teachers are incredibly important. Pay them what they're worth. Someone who really can teach math or science, they're incredibly important. Make sure we can pay those specialists what they're worth. He also advocated sensible teacher tenure reform, and he has remarked that how K-12 education hasn't been very innovative. So he wants to create a mindset of innovation. People are finding these changes very interesting. Tuck narrowly lost the state school superintendent race in 2018. So I'm optimistic about those changes. There's many things I didn't get a chance to cover, but I appreciate your patience. Let me conclude by saying there's a better way. Return to standard economic principles in guiding policymaking, the kind that worked well, that served us the 1950s and 1960s. Prioritize what we really want. We want lower costs of living, good schools, the ability to find good jobs, the ability to keep businesses here, and we want to protect the environment, and we can do all that. How do we do it? By increasing efficiency, by making sure incentives within the organization of policymakers are in line with the incentives of citizens, and making sure there's accountability. This will help restore the California dream. Thank you so much. Special thanks to Ambassador Frank Baxter and to my colleagues at Berkeley, UC Berkeley Social Sciences and Political Sciences for making all this possible. It's been a privilege to have this opportunity, and I've really enjoyed spending my time with you, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Lee, for that very thoughtful and very provocative presentation. And clearly the topic of your talk provoked a real chord among people at Berkeley and in the broader Berkeley community, because we've had so much interest in this talk, and had, I think, 130 questions submitted even just before your talk started. So I've spent a little bit of time going over those questions and trying to look for the broad themes, and probably the biggest theme that people wanted to ask about, and I think it follows pretty well just right on your conclusion slide there, is they want to know, if you were governor, what would you do first? What are the sort of practical steps that could be implemented in California that would start to improve all these, the problem with housing costs and homelessness, of wildfires, of infrastructure, et cetera?
This is the, it's easy for me to sit here and say all these things. And now I'm saying I'm going to take Governor Newsom's place. Interestingly, Governor Brown, in his last couple years in office, came up with some very, very, I think, very interesting and common sense suggestions to reform CEQA. And I think I would start there, because housing costs have become just so difficult for many Californians to deal with. I'm the dad of three, and when I look at the chance of my kids being able to live in California when they grow up, I just say this is going to be really, really difficult. So I would reform CEQA. I would expand ministerial review, so that would essentially allow local areas to just avoid CEQA. I would really try to incentivize development just off the coast, because a lot of the challenges we face in building new housing is in areas such as San Francisco, which, as I mentioned, is 900,000. We're not going to put 80-story skyscrapers in there. They're going to house people. It'll be much easier to do this off the coast, into inland California. And California is not a particularly densely populated state. Once you get inside 30 miles of the coast, there's a lot of open space. So developments such as Newhall Ranch, 60,000 people. I would really try to promote creating new communities where we can implement the newest technologies that would be the most environmentally friendly, most ecologically sensitive. I would really implement high-speed internet and technology investments throughout the Central Valley. So those folks don't have the same advantages as we do. So, so build and build more is what I would really focus on. Governor Newsom knows this. He had what he called a Marshall Plan for housing, and it hasn't really taken off because the fundamental problem, CEQA and local zoning, has been the challenges. So I would really try to promote investment or development away from those areas where it is where it's been fought so much. I would bring cost-benefit analysis into government decision-making more broadly. I would try to make sure that those who run organizations make sure they're accountable and make sure that efficiency is demanded. We talked about the employment department and paying out nearly $500 million in fraudulent claims, while 1.5 million unemployment claims don't go addressed. That just shouldn't happen. So whoever's running organizations need to make sure that they're accountable, and that and if they know they're accountable, better things will happen. Finally, I would try to, I would have a real heart-to-heart with both parties and try to create a vision of more bipartisanship. Neither one listens to each other very much. Democratic Party doesn't really need to listen to Republicans, and the Republicans become increasingly strident. They're frustrated because they don't get listened to. So I would try to create a vision of bipartisanship, and also try to make a sense of how do we make California competitive again? Do we have regulations that that are much more onerous than other states? The evidence says we should reform those. So those are, I think that those would be the areas where I would start.
Thanks. So if Governor Brown and Governor Newsom both think that some of those reforms, and you mentioned CEQA in particular, are good ideas, what can, and this is a question that also probably the second most often asked question is, what can we do? What can members of the audience do to help get those reforms through? Seems like if the governor is supporting it, it should be easy, but obviously that hasn't happened yet.
Yes. So there is a group within the state legislature, both in the Assembly and the Senate. There's a lot of legislation, and this is politically tricky. There's a lot of legislatures who are willing to pull the trigger and reform CEQA or implement new legislation to make it much easier to build. We don't have quite enough yet. So what I would say is that those who listen, just make sure your elected officials know that you make sure they know what your priorities are, and make sure they really know. The politically, this has gone on for so long. It's a politically tough problem because you have people who have who've put their life savings into a home. So they're living in Silicon Valley, and they're living in a 2,000 square foot, 3-bedroom, 2-bath house, and they paid $1.2 million for it. And their nest egg is in that house. And, by God, they want to protect their investment. And they don't want a bus station next door. They don't want a high rise next door. And I get that. We're sort of in this vicious circle now. So that's one reason why I think trying to incentivize more development away from, the whipped cream on the pie, San Francisco, Sunnyvale, Los Gatos, Santa Monica, trying to move a little bit out will be politically much more acceptable. And now this would be difficult financially, but buying up an entire block. So for example, if I'm sitting there and not saying, hey, I don't want this high rise right next door to me, but you buy up a whole city block, and there's areas in Los Angeles where one could do that. And one could create new communities that would be high density communities that would attract mixed use, that would attract new businesses. So trying to say, hey, this single family home that's 8 feet away from you, this is going to become a 12-story apartment building. That's tough to do. Buying up a whole city block, and again, financially is challenging, but we could make that work. That would be easier. But first and foremost, I think people should be telling their elected officials about these issues. I spent most of my time trying to identify these issues because I think just as I go through the stages, not a lot of people know about this, and they'll say, "Wow, is it that bad?" They didn't pay those unemployment claims. It costs $700 a square foot to build affordable housing. What's wrong here? So I think the first part is really identifying the issues and making sure the elected officials know that we're aware and we expect changes.
Thanks. So we also got a number of questions about concerns with failing infrastructure, and you brought up some just startling numbers. And I've also seen startling numbers for the U.S. as a whole about low percentage of spending on infrastructure. What's the evidence around the world, or more generally, about the benefits of that, and any sense for how California compares to other states and to other similar countries?
Yes, we get a grade of D, and it's not as if we're the only D student in the classroom. There's been across states, but there's been a shift away from infrastructure investments as state budgets are more shifted towards healthcare and health and human services. In California, our share of the budget that goes to health and human services is about a third. And I don't know if that's the very top, but if it's not the very top, it's certainly within the top 4 or 5 states, and certainly much higher than states in the South, including Texas. If we just stay on the track we're on right now, health and human services will probably eat up 40% of our budget within 5 years. And that statistic I gave you, that 2/3 of the budget right now is prisons, K-12, and health and human services. And then that's just remarkable statistic, because people should be asking, how does the other stuff get paid for? Well, it's not. The investments are not being made. So it is a national issue. We're worse off here in California, but there are some reforms that can be made in healthcare. Well, again, politically challenging. A lot of hospitals and healthcare providers, don't want pricing transparency, and you ask yourself, well, God, what kind of market is it where I can't get a clear answer from the seller about how much this is going to cost? But the savings could be substantial. Political leadership from Governor Newsom and those in the Assembly and Senate is needed. But the sooner we deal with this, the better, because that 2/3 share of the state budget is just going to continue to grow and really squeeze out investments and all the other stuff the government does if we don't make some changes.
So another theme in many questions was about immigration, and maybe one way of sort of posing the question would be that California has had a very large immigration, and economists tend to be very pro immigration and think that it's good for the economy, but undoubtedly it raises the costs to government in some ways. And so we had a bunch of questions about how much of California's problems or struggles with government policy are driven by the sort of sizable immigration into the state in the last 30 or 40 years.
So California has, certainly become a state with a much larger immigrant share than other states. And Gabe, you mentioned economists usually pro-immigration. Yeah, absolutely. You look at the Fortune 500 today, the 500 largest companies measured by market capitalization. Over half of those were founded by an immigrant or the child of an immigrant. So here in California, we have Google and Sergey Brin, and we have Elon Musk from South Africa and Tesla. So those are people who not only start new businesses, but transform the world we live in. And we want to get as many of those people as we possibly can. We do face challenges with unskilled immigrants, and this is an issue that the United States has faced, for over 40 years. For those who are old enough to remember, I personally don't remember this, but I read about it recently, that during the 1980 presidential race in the Republican Party, it was George Bush Sr. and Ronald Reagan. And of course, Reagan prevailed and he was elected over Jimmy Carter in 1980. But during one of the debates, they talked about undocumented immigration, and this was 40 years ago. So the problem has been with us for a long, long time. We would love to get more highly creative, highly skilled immigrants into California and the United States more broadly. There certainly are costs associated with lower skilled immigrants, and it's a politically challenging, hot button issue. They create economic value here, but they also use services that are costly. I wouldn't pin California's housing crisis on those folks, and I wouldn't point to the losses of efficiency, accountability. Those are really separate issues. I've actually tried to find good estimates of the net cost of low-skilled immigrants. I'm not sure anybody has any, so I wish I could cite some numbers, but I haven't found any as of yet.
Thanks. So another theme that came up in a lot of questions that it'd be great to hear your take on, and you touched on it a couple times during your presentation, is about the role that concentrated interests play in causing trouble or in generating these problems with California public policy. I think you mentioned prison unions in the questions. Many other concentrated interests came up. And this is not only a California issue, but it's an issue that people worry about more generally. And California is a big state. It's hard to organize millions of voters against sort of concentrated interests that can spend all their time in the state legislature working to achieve their goals. How much of that drives the kinds of public policy failures that you've been talking about, and what can we do about it?
Yeah, classic question. It faces us, it faces the rest of the country. It's almost, in principle, it's almost easier to address in the rest of the country because there's some obvious changes that one could make, such as, eliminate subsidies, or maybe keep them if they pass a really obvious cost-benefit test. We say we're committed to climate change, and yet we offer all sorts of subsidies to fossil fuel producers. So the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. So at the national level, eliminating subsidies and having a real simple tax schedule. A real simple tax schedule that really minimizes, so that really reduces the size of the tax book from, this thick down to this thick. At the state level, it's harder to do that because I would love to say, hey, you know what? Let's stop subsidizing. Let's just end it. Somebody comes and asks for it, and you say, hey, you know what? I can't do it. I just can't do it. The problem then is that other states offer subsidies. So at the state level, it's very, very difficult to do. So I would love to see a coordinated effort at the national level to say, you know what, everybody wants to limit special interests. One way we do that is by drastically reducing subsidies, drastically making taxes and regulations much simpler. But it has to be done at a coordinated national level across states. Tough. I'll defer to you guys in the political science department how we get that done. But it's a huge problem. It's a huge problem. During the 60s, I think it was suppressed a bit because both, Pat Brown as a Democrat and the Republicans he worked with, there was sort of a handshake deal about what we do and the integrity we bring to the job. And hey, we're going to be efficient, and you know what, we're not, we're going to do this, but this other stuff we're not going to do. And I think that disciplined behavior. So I wouldn't underestimate the importance of having really, really focused, strong leadership that was solidly behind these principles as possibly making a difference. But in theory, it's a tough. I think we know what to do. It's a tough nut to crack politically.
Well, thanks, Lee. I think I just got the signal that we're over time. So I just wanted to say thank you so much and pass it on to Christian Gordon, who's going to close us out. And a big round of applause for.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it and really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lenz, and thank you, Professor Ohanian, for joining us today. In closing the program, I wanted to add a few expressions of gratitude, first and foremost to Professor Ohanian for giving of his time and his flexibility to reschedule this program, and to Frank Baxter and Gabe Lenz for all of their work to design and implement the program. Thanks to Rocker Ray for opening up and reaffirming the campus's commitment to providing diversity of thought on campus. Most importantly, I want to thank all of you for joining us today and powerfully signaling how valued and important this type of programming is. We look forward to sharing information on future events along these lines and exploring several different areas, some of which Professor Ohanian touched on today. But your showing up, you're giving of your time, and you're coming together around this topic is a powerful signal, and thank you. I also want to thank the Honorable Frank Baxter. It's been my pleasure to work with him over these last 6 years that I've been at UC Berkeley, half of the 12 Baxter Liberty Initiative events that we've held. And I want to congratulate Frank on the amazing turnout today and the affirmation of his partnership, which was launched 12 years ago with then Dean of Social Sciences, Carla Hesse. Many people expressed the importance of providing forums for diverse viewpoints on campus, and Frank Baxter did something about it. We should all take inspiration from that and share our gratitude that he has created through his generosity, his thoughtfulness, over a decade of powerful programming that has opened the door to several relationships for us exploring different areas, hosting the American Enterprise Institute's Western Regional Policy Summit, advancing relationships with speakers like Arthur Brooks, Greg Lukianoff, and now Leo Ohanian, a tremendous legacy of speakers and programming. So Frank, thank you for all you continue to do, for your commitment and your effort in support of our students, our alumni, our faculty, and our community. Thanks again to all of you, and best wishes for a restful and peaceful holiday and New Year. Thank you.